The door opened before I could reach the window. I didn't turn. I heard it in the silence first, the shift in the air, the pause of a man who was not expecting to find anyone inside his private chambers. Then his voice came, low, controlled, and dangerously close. "You shouldn't be here." Only then did I move. Slowly I turned from the desk that was not mine, in a room I had no right to enter. Duke Alastair Beaumont stood at the threshold, still gloved, as if he had just returned, his gaze fixed on me with sharp, immediate suspicion. Not shock, not confusion, recognition. Good. That meant he was paying attention. "I was expected," I said calmly. A lie, but not the kind he thought. His eyes narrowed slightly as he stepped inside, closing the door behind him with deliberate precision. No witnesses, no interruption, just distance collapsing between us as he crossed the room. "Expected?" he repeated. "In my private study?" There it was, the moment where any other woman would retreat. Apologize, explain, leave. I did none of those things. Instead, I held his gaze and waited, because this exact moment was the reason I had come. They would later say I had been discovered inside the Duke's house by accident. They were wrong. I had been waiting for him to return. Leaving his house had been easier than getting inside it. His gaze remained on me long after Genevieve had guided me away. It was not a look of pity, but of profound, frustrated curiosity. That was precisely the hook I needed. Our next encounter was a week later, in the quiet solitude of Lord Ashworth's library during a dreadfully dull charity luncheon. I had slipped away, knowing Alastair's intolerance for vapid conversation would eventually drive him to do the same. I was examining a leather-bound atlas when his reflection appeared in the glass of the bookshelf. "A Duchess in hiding," he observed, his voice a low murmur that still managed to fill the silent room. He stood closer than propriety dictated, his presence a heavy weight in the air. An unusual sight. "Not hiding, Duke," I replied, not turning to face him. I traced the outline of a shipping route with my fingertip, merely seeking better company. The implication hung between us. I was allowing the insult, allowing the proximity. A woman in my disgraced position should have been demure, apologetic. I was not. He moved to stand beside me, our shoulders nearly touching. "Your cousin paints a picture of a woman unraveling, yet here you are, calmly studying maps." His voice was laced with suspicion. He was trying to reconcile the frantic creature from the ballroom with the composed woman before him. "My cousin has a talent for artistry," I said simply. I then closed the atlas with a soft thud, turned, and met his gaze. "But she has never understood geography." It was a nonsensical statement, designed to irritate and intrigue. I saw the flicker of annoyance in his eyes, the tightening of his jaw. He thought he was investigating a scandal. He didn't realize he was being recruited. A few days later, at a garden party, I allowed him to see me speaking with Lady Danbury, the most notorious gossip in the peerage. I knew Alastair despised her, saw her as a venomous source of the very rumors that plagued me. He watched from across the lawn, his disapproval a palpable force. Later, he cornered me by a secluded stone bench overlooking the rose garden. "You should not encourage her," he said, his tone clipped and possessive. It was almost an order. "And why not?" I asked, tilting my head. "When society has already condemned me, what harm is there in speaking to the executioner?" His frustration was magnificent. He expected me to defend myself, to protest my innocence. Instead, I was leaning into the narrative, embracing the persona of the fallen woman. This inexplicable behavior was a knot he couldn't untangle. He saw a reckless, self-destructive act. He couldn't comprehend it was a deliberate signal, a message sent via the city's most effective courier. The information I had fed Lady Danbury was a carefully crafted piece of misinformation designed for one specific audience: Genevieve. He moved closer still, his voice dropping. "What do you want, Beatrice?" The use of my first name was a breach, a sign his composure was cracking. The air between us was thick with unasked questions and the scent of rain-soaked roses. From a distance, to any prying eyes, it would have looked like an intimate, perhaps romantic confrontation. A powerful duke drawn to a tragic duchess. I did not answer his question. I simply let him stand there, caught in the web of my silence. That encounter wasn't chance. It was the second move in a sequence he had yet to recognize. The story everyone believed began to fray during a charity concert at the Royal Opera House. In the hushed intermission, amidst the scent of champagne and expensive perfume, Alistair found me by the grand staircase. He dispensed with pleasantries. "I was reviewing my family's old investment portfolios," he began, his voice low and intense. "My father held shares in Blackwood Shipping for decades. The dividends were famously consistent. For them to simply cease, it's unprecedented." He was not asking a question. He was stating a professional anomaly that offended his logical mind. Before I could answer, Genevieve materialized at his elbow, her smile a brittle thing. "Alistair, you mustn't trouble her with business. The doctors advise against any undue stress." Her hand fluttered to my shoulder, a gesture that was both protective and silencing. It was a mistake. Her defensiveness was too sharp, her intervention too swift. Alistair's eyes narrowed slightly. He looked from her panicked face to my calm one. "I was merely expressing my condolences, Lady Genevieve." His tone was cool, but the observation had been made. Why was she so desperate to keep me from speaking about the company's affairs? The second crack appeared later that evening, during the customary charity auction. The final item was a set of rare first-edition novels. The bidding was spirited, quickly reaching several hundred guineas. As the auctioneer was about to bring the hammer down, I raised my hand. 1,000 guineas, I said. My voice was not loud, but it carried through the stunned silence that followed. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Duchess Blackwood, the woman who had supposedly lost everything, was making a bid that would have been considered extravagant even before her ruin. I saw Genevieve's face drain of all color. The Marquis of Thorne, standing beside her, looked at me with a sudden, cold watchfulness. He saw not a confused woman, but an unpredictable variable. I did not win the books. I had no intention of doing so. My purpose was to make an impossible move, to present a contradiction so blatant it could not be ignored. After the concert, as carriages were being called, Alistair caught my arm, his grip firm. He pulled me into a shadowed alcove, away from prying eyes. "What was that?" he demanded, his voice a low growl of pure frustration. "Where did you get that kind of money?" "Some assets are not as liquid as others, Duke," I replied cryptically. He ignored that. "Your cousin mentioned the final collapse was triggered by the sale of the northern properties at a catastrophic loss. She said you personally signed the deeds in a fit of panic." I held his gaze and said nothing. The lie was hers to own. The next day, a messenger delivered a note from him. It contained only one sentence. "There is no public record of any such sale." He thought he had discovered the first lie. He had no idea I had just handed him the thread to unravel it all. He summoned me to his study the next morning. The air was cold, thick with unspoken accusations. He stood by the window, the morning light casting his face in severe lines. He did not offer me a seat. "I spent the night with my solicitors," he said, his voice flat and hard. The Blackwood Northern properties were not sold. They were, however, leveraged as collateral against a series of high-interest loans from a previously unknown financial entity, Everington Holdings. He turned to face me, his eyes boring into mine. "An entity, my sources tell me, with quiet but significant ties to the Marquis of Thorne." I met his gaze without faltering. "I know." The simplicity of my admission seemed to strike him more than any denial could have. He took a step closer, his frustration a palpable heat between us. "You know, Beatrice, this is not a game. This is grand larceny masked as incompetence. People are talking about your bid at the opera, whispering that you must have a hidden benefactor. Your reputation is transforming from tragic to scandalous. Why are you letting this happen? Why did you not expose her?" This was the moment, the partial turn of the key. Because exposing Genevieve would have been a temporary victory, I said, my voice as calm and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. It would have stopped my cousin, but it would not have stopped her master. Alistair stared at me, confusion warring with dawning horror. Her master? Genevieve understands ambition and envy. She does not understand subordinated debt or offshore holding companies. Someone had to teach her. Someone had to provide the infrastructure for her theft. I allowed a beat of silence to let the implication solidify. Every forged document, every falsified loss in our ledgers, it was all designed to systematically devalue Blackwood shipping, to make it appear so crippled, so worthless, that a predator could acquire it for nothing. He finally understood. He had been investigating a family betrayal, a sordid affair of jealousy and greed. He was now looking at a calculated corporate raid executed with military precision. The social ruin, the whispers, my public disgrace. It was all just camouflage for a much larger crime. Reputations were at stake, yes, but not just mine. If a house as old as Blackwood could be dismantled from the inside like this, no one was safe. Thorn, he breathed, the name tasting like poison. He's using her to tear your house down from within, just to pick over the bones. He thought he had reached the bottom of it. He believed he finally saw the whole ugly picture. He was wrong. You're close, Duke, I said softly, delivering the final crucial piece of the puzzle. But his objective isn't just to pick over the bones. I paused, letting the weight of my next words settle before I spoke them. He wants the entire skeleton. He is not after the Blackwood fortune. He is after our shipping routes. Genevieve is not his partner. She is simply the price of entry. My war council now consisted of two. Alistair was no longer a judge, but a weapon, and I intended to aim him with precision. The first move was not an attack, but a whisper. At the ambassador's dinner, I made a point of engaging Lord Pembroke, a man whose investments were nearly as vast as his capacity for gossip. Alistair watched from across the room as I, with an air of innocent curiosity, inquired about a minor shipping company in which Pembroke held an interest. A company I knew had recently suffered losses due to a sudden aggressive tariff change orchestrated by the Marquis of Thorn. A terrible misfortune, Lord Pembroke, I murmured, my voice laced with feigned sympathy. One almost wonders if the Marquis knew the tariffs were coming. His own routes were so conveniently unaffected. It was a perfectly crafted insinuation, deniable, untraceable. But Pembroke's eyes sharpened with a new, avaricious light. I had not given him a fact, but a lens through which to re-examine his own losses. The whisper had been launched. Within days, the city's financial circles would be alive with a new kind of rumor, not about my weakness, but about Thorn's predatory foresight. The second move was to arm my general. I arranged another accidental meeting with Alistair in the British Museum, amidst the cold, silent judgment of marble statues. I handed him a slim portfolio. "What is this?" he asked, his voice low. "A gift," I replied. "It is Genevieve's copy of the forged Blackwood ledgers, the ones she so proudly maintains as proof of my incompetence. Note the ink, the paper. It's all flawlessly aged, a masterpiece of deception." He took the portfolio, the weight of it seeming to settle in his hands. He was now in possession of concrete evidence of a crime. He was no longer just a confidant. He was a co-conspirator in the pursuit of justice. His honor was now bound to my cause. My final move was against Genevieve herself. I found her at a musicale, basking in the glow of feigned sympathy. I approached her, my expression one of weary resignation. "You've won, Genevieve," I said, my voice just loud enough for those nearby to hear. I let a tremor enter my words. "The fight is gone from me. Do what you will with what's left of our name." Her eyes widened, first in shock, then in triumphant, barely concealed glee. She saw my surrender as the final clearing of the path. This calculated display of defeat was crucial. It would make her and the Marquis overconfident, reckless. It would ensure they proceeded with their final public spectacle without fear of interruption. A week later, the embossed invitation arrived. It was for a private auction at the Marquis of Thorn's residence. The centerpiece was to be the original Blackwood Charter, the very soul of my family's legacy. It was their checkmate, a public execution of my name. Alistair came to my home, the invitation clutched in his hand, his face a grim mask of fury. "We cannot let this happen." "On the contrary," I said, calmly fastening a diamond clasp at my wrist. "We have been counting on it." The stage was set. The actors had their scripts. I simply needed to arrive for the final act. Our arrival at the Marquis of Thorne's residence sent a ripple of shock through the assembled guests. Me, the disgraced Duchess, walking in on the arm of the unimpeachable Duke Beaumont. It was a sight so unexpected it silenced the room. Genevieve, standing beside the Marquis, went pale. Her look of triumph faltered, replaced by a flicker of pure panic. We took our seats near the front. I ignored the whispers, the stares. I focused only on the small auction stage, where the Blackwood Charter was displayed under a spotlight like a relic in a tomb. Finally, the moment came. The Marquis held up a hand, silencing the auctioneer. "My friends," he began, his voice smooth as oil, "we are here tonight to witness a tragedy, but also to witness an act of devotion." He turned his gaze to Genevieve, who looked up at him with practiced adoration. "Therefore, I will not allow this piece of history to be sold. I will purchase it directly and place it in the care of the one person who has fought to preserve her family's honor, Lady Genevieve Sterling." A murmur of approval went through the crowd. As they began to applaud, I rose from my seat. "That will not be necessary, my Lord Marquess." My voice, though quiet, cut through the applause like glass. Every head turned to me. The Marquess's smile froze on his face. I walked calmly to the front of the room, Alistair a step behind me. I did not raise my voice. I did not weep or rage. "For months you have all been told a story," I said, my gaze sweeping across the stunned faces. "A story of my incompetence. Tonight, I will tell you the true story." And I did. With cold, irrefutable precision, I laid out the entire conspiracy. I spoke of the forged ledgers, and then Alistair, at my signal, stepped forward and presented the real ones to the most senior peer in the room. I spoke of the secret sale of assets, and I named the shell companies, the dates, the amounts. Then I turned my attention to the Marquess. But this was not merely the act of a jealous cousin. She had a tutor. I held up the packet of letters. "A series of letters, my Lord Marquess, in your own hand, instructing my cousin on the finer points of forgery, guiding her in a plot to systematically devalue and seize the Blackwood shipping interests." I handed the letters to Duke Beaumont, who began to read excerpts aloud. The Marquis's words, cold and calculating, filled the horrified silence. Genevieve began to sob, not in sadness, but in the agony of exposure. The Marquis stood as if turned to stone, his face a mask of fury and ruin. The power in the room had not just shifted, it had been annihilated and rebuilt in my image. They were no longer seeing a victim. They were seeing the architect of a verdict, and she was delivering the sentence. There was no sound in the Marquis's grand salon after the final letter was read. Not a whisper, not a breath. Just the profound, ringing silence of absolute social obliteration. Genevieve was the first to break, her sobs devolving into a raw, ugly wail as she was led from the room, a ghost before she had even crossed the threshold. The Marquis did not move. He simply stood there, a statue of ruin, until the last guest had filed out, leaving him alone in the wreckage of his ambition. The narrative of my life was rewritten overnight. The whispers did not cease, but their subject changed. Pity was replaced by a quiet, reverent awe. I was no longer the tragic victim, but something far more dangerous, a woman whose patience was a weapon and whose silence was a strategy. The Blackwood name, once synonymous with failure, now commanded a new kind of respect, one born not of wealth, but of unassailable control. Alistair visited me a month later, in the library where he had first confronted me. He stood for a long moment, simply watching me. "I misjudged you, Beatrice," he said finally. His voice held no apology, only a statement of fact. Profoundly. I looked up from my book, offering him a small, placid smile. The game was over. The pieces were back in their box. Most people did, I replied. They mistook the destruction of my reputation for the destruction of my power. In society, a reputation is a fortress. Some spend their lives building impenetrable walls. I had simply let my enemies lay siege to the wrong one.